Allora, let me give you an introduction to Leonardo's Codices. Leonardo da Vinci Codices are among the most famous manuscripts in Western cultures. Yet, with the exception of a few specialists, their direct reading is a very difficult undertaking, for the general public at least. Indeed, they are extremely unsystematic and complex texts. One of their most well-known peculiarities is, of course, Leonardo's mirror script. He wrote backwards, from right to left. For example, in this detail from manuscript D, the word I have highlighted in the upper left corner is the Italian word perché, meaning why, written from right to left. You see the P, E, R, etc. This led some to assume that Leonardo, this was a way to protect his discovery from prying eyes at a time when copyright was, had not yet to exist. More likely, I think that the fact that Leonardo's mirror script is a first, in my view, is a first example of the link between the particular structure of his codices and his style of research, his education also, his training. Indeed, he began his career as an artist and a technician in Renaissance Florence, and only later was it to turn more and more into what we would now call a scientist. As a child, he was educated in Vinci. He then became an apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop in Florence. He therefore did not follow any regular or academic course of study. And basically, nobody tried to correct his habit of writing from right to left. That's all. But let me give you now an overview of Leonardo's Codices. An important distinction is between real codices and collection of loose sheets. For example, what we call the Codex Atlanticus is actually a huge collection of sheets that Leonardo kept loose. A later collector bound them to form a volume which for its huge format, similar to an atlas, was then called Codex Atlanticus. The true codices are made of pages that were already bound in Leonardo's time, or at least kept together as fascicles. These codices are of different sizes, an important distinction because it tells us much about Leonardo's work and style of research. Some codices have a very small format, typically 10 by 7 or 8 centimeters, like this. This is a classical pocket-sized manuscript of Leonardo. Their pocket size was compatible with being used outside the studio or the workshop. These are notebooks in which Leonardo, while observing nature outdoors, quickly noted an observation, an idea, or realized a quick sketch of a natural phenomenon. Here are some examples from this pocket-sized manuscript. The Codex Forster, and in one of them the drawing of an ear or something like corn, which shows how Leonardo studied the shape and arrangement of the grains. And in this other side, the Codex K, with drawings and notes concerning the flight of the birds Leonardo used at this time to observe on the hills around Florence. And finally, the Codex I, with a dog's head, the drawing of a dog's head with a quick study of its proportions. As you can see, these drawings and notes come to life through the observation of nature. They are made with red or black chalk, that is, with tools compatible with field use, unlike a pen and inkwell, which would be difficult to use outdoors. In the case of the notes on the flight of the birds from manuscript K, we see how they were first outlined in charcoal or more likely in black chalk. Then, back in his studio, Leonardo would go over them with pen and ink to make them clearer and more permanent. You can see how in the upper part, for example, of this sheet, the ink covers the original text written with the black chalk. These pocket-sized codices are indeed fascinating and fundamental documents of Leonardo's work. Leonardo, unlike Galileo, Newton, and other great scientists of the past, did not realize and publish systematic treatises, but as an acute observer of nature and at the same time one of the greatest draftsmen of all time, gave us a unique opportunity in the history of science, allowing us to see almost at first hand how a scientist of the past looked at nature. But let's analyze another category of codices, those with a larger format. Here you can see a reproduction of one of these larger format codices, and for comparison, a pocket-sized manuscript. Leonardo usually compiled these larger codices at a desk in his studio, in the workshop, or in any workplace where a desk could be used. They are therefore manuscripts that contain more orderly notes and drawings, studies resulting from more calm reflection and not just quick notes taken during a walk on the hills around Florence or a hike along the Adda River in Lombardy to observe the water currents. As you can see, these larger format codices often contain pen and ink notes and drawings made while Leonardo was sitting at a table, which meant that, at least in some cases, he was able to realize more complex and finished drawings and write tidier notes. In general, and relatively speaking, these are more monothematic codices, unlike the more mixed nature of the pocket-sized manuscript as far as concerns the content. Of course, there are relationships between these two types of codices. For example, the quick notes inserted in one of the pocket-sized codices, the Codex K we have seen before, are marked off with a line and labeled with a small cross. You can recognize both, I think, here. That means that these notes were copied and developed in a larger and more finished manuscript. Okay, which we have lost. So in none of the manuscripts known to us survived. We can find these notes. So that means that this is one of the many lost manuscripts of Leonardo. Obviously, the distinction I have proposed between pocket-sized codices and studio codices is not rigid. It is not so rigid, and a fleeting note or a quick sketch may appear in the margin of a more finished manuscript, and vice versa. But within the category of the most finished and larger codices that were completed indoors, what kind of finished manuscript did Leonardo actually produce? They are far different from what one would imagine, and I can use the term finished only in comparison to his pocket-sized manuscript. Indeed, if we open the Codex Leicester, we find a page, why this? Okay, if we open the Codex Leicester, we find a page like this with astronomical studies dedicated to the relationship between the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon. But if we turn the page, the subject changes and we find studies of hydrology related to the origin of water springs in high mountains. In Leonardo's manuscript, there is no continuity of discourse between one page and the next, even in the more finished codices as the Codex Leicester is. A manuscript by Leonardo is made up of successive units which do not form a continuous discourse that is readable from cover to cover. In some cases, the page is devoted to a single theme, but in other cases, apparently unrelated themes follow one another on the same page. Often, there is a link between these various issues that alternate from page to page or within a single page, but it is not immediately recognizable. However, in such an unsystematic universe, there is a sense, an order, that tells us a lot about Leonardo's mind and cultural background. In my view, two aspects are illuminating and should be analyzed. It's worth to analyze. First, a form of connection that is recognizable among different pages in a given codex. Second, Leonardo's tendency to limit the discourse to the single page. Let's begin for the first connection, the connection between various pages in some codices. We shall look at two examples. Leonardo compiled the Codex on the Flight of the Birds from what, for us, is the last page, and moving to the beginning, that is from right to left, just like its backward scripts. Now, this codex begins with pages containing studies on how birds can rise from the ground and stay in flight by actively flapping their wings, on the left in the slide. These pages are immediately followed by sheets with technological studies in which Leonardo tries to project a flying machine which, thanks to man's muscular strength, can imitate the active flight of the birds, the page on the right. Then another section in this codex follows with pages devoted to the equilibrium maneuvers used by birds for soaring in the wind. And these are in turn followed by pages with projects, mechanical projects for the flying machine that can mimic the bird's natural maneuvers. So there is it is true that there is no continuity of discourse between these various pages, but there is no continuity, no continuous text that one reads from beginning to end, but there is a general sense of connection, and it is very deep and original. The connection between an analytical observation of nature and its technological limitation, between knowing and creating, or, if you prefer, knowing to create. The section of the codex are made like this. So you find first a section dealing with how to study the natural world, studies dealing with the natural flight, and then follows a section in which Leonardo tries to imitate in a machine these studies. So is not a continuous text, but there is a sense, there is an order. and it has to do with Leonardo's style of research. The Codex Leicester has the same structure. So during the preparation of this new edition of the Codex, with Martin, we have realized that the Codex, what we call the Codex Leicester, originated from the unification by Leonardo himself of two sets of sheets or fascicles compiled perhaps at slightly different times. Many of the more internal pages of the Codex, let's say the inner set, are mainly devoted to the study of water and how it erodes riverbanks or the sea coast, while the outer set of pages of the Codex covers more general and cosmological theories based on the observation contained in the first part of the Codex. So again, there is a link between the structure of this codex and Leonardo's style of research. Hence, the only form of connection that can be found between the various pages of Leonardo's Codices, or at least in the case of some of them, of those devoted to a single theme or almost, reflects Leonardo's mind and style of research as an artist, technician, and scientist, knowing to create, studying nature to recreate it in a machine or in a geological theory, in a scientific theory. It is very likely that Leonardo's training and activity as an artist are also reflected in another aspect of his scientific codices, the tendency to limit his discourse to a single page. This is an example, an anatomical sheet dealing with embryology, which Leonardo began when he was in Milan, so in around 1509, but he continued to add notes. The notes I highlighted in red were added when he was in Rome in 1513, so many years later. So basically, he conceived a single page really like a canvas, continuing to add to the page notes and drawings, like adding strokes to a canvas, like a painter, no, like a painter. So I can finish with a small comparison. This original method, let's say this original method of compilation of Leonardo's Codices was the direct consequence of Leonardo's being an artist, a technician, and at the same time a scientist, and means that he never but he never accomplished an organic, complete, finished scientific treatise. However, once again, this is Leonardo, and let me try this conclusion. I don't know if Bill Wallace will agree, who is a specialist of Michelangelo, will agree with me. If some of Michelangelo's sculptures are perhaps the most famous non finito works in the history of art, unfinished works in the history of art, Leonardo's Codices are the most important unfinished works in the history of science. And in both cases, they were deliberately unfinished, the result of a choice, the expression of a special vision of the world and creativity. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Please.
I agree with Domenico. Okay. And now we get to be Leonardo. Now you get to draw like Leonardo. Finally, you've learned enough about Leonardo to become Leonardo. So you all have Leonardo in front of you. And we're going to take a look at two sheets of Leonardo's 7,000 or so sheets. And we're going to actually think about how we draw, or how Leonardo draws, just taking 2 examples of 7,000 and learning something about how Leonardo draws. But let me give you some basic principles. Let's think about Ross King and how he talked about facing a blank wall. Well, facing a blank sheet is something of the same thing. There are certain basic principles of facing a blank wall or facing a blank sheet. So let's think about it. Every artist has certain peculiarities when they face a blank sheet or face a blank wall. And most people tend to do the same thing over and over and over again. I've looked at all of Michelangelo drawings. I haven't looked, like Martin Kemp and certain other people in this room, at all of Leonardo's drawings. But I have a pretty good sense. When you divide a sheet like this, Michelangelo always, almost always, starts up in that upper left-hand quadrant. For the most part, I have a sense that Leonardo favors that upper right-hand quadrant, but closer to the center. Remember now, he's a left-handed draftsman. So this has something to do with where you start and how you then fill a sheet. So let's pretend and think about how one starts on the blank sheet and how one fills it. So I have purposely chosen kind of complicated sheets. And you must try and imagine the blank sheet and then the order of drawings that happen on this sheet. And that's my challenge to you. But let's give one or a couple other principles. So we're looking at 2 vertical drawings, but what if Leonardo had a horizontal? If you're a left-handed draftsman, one might tend to think that you would draw from one side to the other because you wouldn't want to get your hand in the way of your drawings. So you might expect that you would draw that way from left to right, thank you. I'm working backwards from the screen here. Exactly, but so those might be basic principles. And then the other principle I would suggest would be the theme sheet that Martin Kemp showed us the other day, that Leonardo tends to work very close to what he just drew. The one thing he drew, he draws right close to it. And they're usually related in some ways and very close to one another. So let's start with the sheet that you have in front of us of cats. And let's try and guess, and I'll probably walk you through the first one, and then we'll challenge you on the more difficult second one on the back. And we'll make you try and guess on the back. But let's walk ourselves through the first one with cats. And let's try and guess, what do you think would probably be the first drawing? Try and imagine this sheet as a blank sheet. Let's know that Leonardo, in this case, is an observer of the world. He's looking at the world. What is he drawing first? What do you think? We've found the basic principles. Would you probably guess what I'm guessing? Do you think that's number 1?
Yes.
Does anybody disagree? That's probably the sleeping cat. It's a beautifully observed drawing. It's close to the center. If you think of the blank sheet, only children start on a blank sheet way down here in the corner. Only a child starts drawing down here. All artists draw towards the center of a sheet. Okay, then let's think of what the second drawing will be. You probably can guess it. Martin Kemp's principle of closeness, the theme sheet, that's also the cat, isn't it? Just a slightly different version of it. Okay, well, now the third one is a little bit more difficult, and you might disagree on this. I have numbered a third, and I put that as 3, but you could argue that the version of the cat that just woke up way over on the right-hand border might be number 3. But if you imagine the sheet as blank, wouldn't that be a very odd arrangement? He's leaving a whole lot of the sheet absolutely blank and working way over at the edge. But you could argue very well, because that group of 3 cats makes a very beautiful set of drawings, and suddenly the cat woke up. But then if you make that 3, then I would go up to the top of the sheet and draw all that whole group of cats at the top of the sheet. But okay, let's go with my 3rd, because if you go with the 3rd, then you're working around the center of the sheet, which sort of makes more artistic sense. And then, of course, that follows right away, okay? And then if you do that, now we're getting complicated, but this probably follows. We're working around the center of the sheet, okay? And then we get to maybe that. And then it starts to get very complicated, okay? Maybe back to 7. And now I have no idea. But you can you can guarantee that the dragon that is at an angle down here is going to come last, or very towards the end. This is a sheet that starts out as Leonardo looking at nature, looking at a cat, drawing it from different angles, waking up, making drawing after drawing after drawing, sometimes looking at his own drawing, then imagining it, then watching it puff up, and then all of a sudden it becomes a dragon. Yeah, when did it become a dragon? Why did it become a dragon? And you just sort of see his mind at work and watch it becoming fluid and surprising this is a sheet of just sudden nature studies, but all of a sudden the imagination takes over. It doesn't take flight quite, not quite like Domenico's, all of a sudden becoming mechanical studies, but you can sort of all of a sudden see it. This is a very early drawing. We're only in the realm of nature, but it's all of a sudden nature becoming imaginative. Okay, so should we turn to the more difficult problem now, much later in life? In Milan, turn the sheet over, and all of a sudden we're faced with the much more complicated task of, yes, observation, but now with writing and drawing. But Domenico just gave you another clue. He just gave you another clue at the very end of his talk, that Leonardo could come back much later and write on his page. So just keep that in mind as well. So what your task is now for the next couple of minutes, and you can talk among yourselves, try and go 1, 2, 3, or 4. Try and get 1, 2, 3, or 4 on this thing. What's the first drawing on this page? What's the second? What's the third? And you have to put in the writing too. Is he going from drawing to writing? Back to drawing? Is it 1, 2? Is it writing, drawing, writing, drawing? Is it drawing, 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 drawing? How does Leonardo's mind work? Does it all drawing, then writing? Does he go back and forth between writing and drawing? Those are different sides of the brain. Domenico knows. Think of the blank sheet. Ken, you're not doing your exercise. You give up? No. Yeah. And, yeah. Okay, thanks. Okay, are we about ready to make a stab at this? Only Domenico and Martin are not allowed to say anything. They're the only ones who know. I mean, Martin, actually, I took this, these pages are from Martin, a wonderful book by Martin, who did this and also translated all these things, so I knew what was going on, but even so, it's a very, very difficult operation here. But okay, so are we ready? Okay. You have an idea, we can do some voting. So I have a suggestion here. I did this with my students, and one of my students adamantly said this was the first. Does anybody in the room agree? You see, you've learned a lot about Leonardo already in 1.5 days. No Leonardo would ever start like that. No way in the world. First of all, that doesn't how he draw, and that's not what's going on. That's not how he starts a page. Okay, so do you have an idea? What is the first drawing? Towards the very center of the page there, in the very center, the sort of small detail, the very center, that's a detail. It's a detail of something. You don't start with the detail. The detail is a detail of an... Ooh, that's not where... There, Billy's got it. Don't we think? Does Martin agree? Yes. Does Domenico agree? Absolutely. Okay. Well, I've got the two experts agreeing with me, so this is the largest drawing. It fills, you start at the top of the page, come down, you're using the maximum amount of the sheet, you're doing the most amount of work, you're covering the most complex parts of the body, and now you have a lot of work to do, okay? So what's going to come next? Okay? Right. You're studying details of that. You're pulling it apart, right? You're pulling it apart. And now you're pulling it apart a lot more. Now comes that detail at the center, right? Yeah. Now you're really looking into that shoulder. You're pulling it apart. You're anatomizing it. Oh, at this point, has anybody put in writing? 5 minutes. Domenico, has any writing gone on yet? Has Leonardo started any writing, or is he doing drawing?
Or
Beautiful.
The
Beautiful.
note came after the note.
If you look very, very closely, you'll see how the writing overlaps the drawing, fits in among the drawing. The writing all comes after the drawing. So keep looking. So let's go on. I didn't follow through it all because it gets very, very complicated. And I'm not absolutely certain. I'm not an anatomist, but I kind of followed those first 3 steps, and it gets very, very complicated. But what we really find is something like 1, 2, 3 for sure. Then 4, probably. I think 4 is a redoing of 3, getting it more precise. And then the writing comes all afterwards. And what I counted up was there are 8 drawing episodes and 13 writing episodes. This is an enormously complicated sheet where Leonardo's really learning an awful lot, but just studying one shoulder thing. But I think one learns really an awful lot about an artist and how his thinking takes place by following his process, his sequence of thinking. As Martin showed in that theme sheet, just watching him move from one thing to the next and following the process. When we find the finished sheet, sometimes we're sort of overwhelmed by its complexity and its beauty, but watching it in the sequential process is actually an unfolding of Leonardo's mind is an equally fascinating process. Thank you very much for being Leonardo for a minute. We have a couple minutes for questions. Yes?
First of all, I presume he's doing these while there is a cadaver on the table, and he would not have a lot of time to write, therefore he wants to get the drawings in.
I think that's exactly right. I think Domenico needs to come back up here, though, to help answer, because I'm not an anatomist.
But my question is, I presume he could read his script without a mirror?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Of course.
Yes.
He wrote naturally backwards, without a mirror. He didn't need a mirror.
Did he own all of the codexes at the time of his death?
Sorry?
Did he possess all of the portfolios at the time of his death?
This is a difficult question. I would say most of them, but who knows? Leonardo was not a solitary person, so he exchanged the information, knowledge with other people when he was in France. So perhaps he lent some of his manuscript to another scientist, another natural philosopher working around him at the same time. The point is that, as I told you before, we have lost most of Leonardo's manuscript. It is difficult to say how many, but we have lost many of them. So perhaps he lent some of them to other people, and so this is a problem. Perhaps not yet discovered some of the manuscript.
Yes. Stefan.
The one question that has not been asked, and actually obviously not answered yet, what exactly was the purpose of all these writings? Was it just a personal, confidential diary like the Masonic rites? Or was he prepared to offer it for peer review and have it with discussions with his fellow scientists to see whether it turns into a teaching tool?
I think it's a whole range. I think it's everything. I think it's from personal diary to the intention of writing a treatise on the equine of a horse, to anatomy, to a treatise on art. But this was a person who every day was writing and drawing with the intention of, yes, putting out his knowledge into the public, but also was writing a personal diary constantly. This was somebody who was just constantly writing and constantly producing. Isn't that true?
It's true. In the case Bill, you shown, most of these notes were for himself. So he writes, in many of these notes, redrawn the same thing in another way. So basically most of these notes are plans for better representation of the same anatomical specimen. So these are notes from themselves, plans for work in this case. In other cases, it depends. It depends on the manuscript, on the sheet. Thank you.
So these are like preparations to do an anatomical treatise.
Yeah.
It may be of interest. We can do an estimate of how much has got lost, which I did at one point. Francesco Melzi transcribes the manuscript now in the Vatican, the so-called Treatise of Painting. And Melzi had access, as Leonardo's heir, to most of his manuscripts. And if we look at the proportion of texts we can identify the source of, compared with texts we can't identify the source of his writings on art, 4/5 are lost. 4/5 are no longer traceable in any manuscript. Yeah. But if you then think, well, probably the writings on art are more likely to survive than some of the really obscure stuff, we're probably dealing with maybe 1/7 has survived. But I then reckoned up, if you multiplied up by simply a 5, not the big figure there, to the amount of writing he did. The Codex Leicester has got something like 70,000 words in it. But I worked out that he had done 38 to 40 academic-sized books during the course of his lifetime. So he wasn't idle.
Fantastic. And now we're out of time, and it's time for Jeff Koons.